mouthpiece, a weak, simplistic mouthpiece.
Stop the pollution! Fracking is a false solution!
That chant sounds like the typical anti-fracking protest, maybe at an oil and gas conference or outside Shell or Exxon headquarters, but that protest wasn't for an oil executive or for a pipeline ruling. It was for left-leaning blogger Matthew Yglesias. See, Climate Defense had organized the protest because Matt argued that Kamala Harris was right to oppose a fracking ban. They later tweeted, "As a room full of Beltway sheeple looked on in shock, we confronted Matt directly." You often hear about how divided the right has become in the Trump era, but the left has become very fractured in its own way. Left-leaning activists reject the incrementalism of establishment Democrats, while establishment figures worry about alienating moderate voters. According to Pew Research, Democrats' view of their own party has grown more negative over the past year, reflecting deeper tensions about strategy, priorities, and what it means to be a progressive today. So, where do Democrats go from here? How do they reshape the party, keep a diverse political coalition together, and broaden the tent? Welcome to Everybody Gets Pie, the podcast about making the American pie of opportunity big enough so that everybody can get their slice. This is a podcast focused on the need for more American abundance in housing, in energy, in childcare, innovation, and more. I'm Justine, and as always, I'm joined by Armand and Burhan. Great to see you both.
Happy to be here, Justine. This is going to be a really exciting conversation. I think Matt is really well known for his aggressive tweets and his blog, which can sometimes get a lot of traction. I was also going to say, Armand, last time you mentioned that it was 4 elected officials and you on the podcast. This time, hopefully, it's balanced by 2 tweeters and 2 politicians.
I'm more in the junior varsity league of tweeters, but I'm glad to be in that comparison.
It's funny. I have to stay off of Twitter because otherwise I feel like my blood pressure goes up. So anyway, I appreciate what you do, Armand. I tip my hat to you. It's funny. I was convinced for the longest time that the Republican Party was undergoing this transformation, and it was temporary transformation, and maybe Democrats would pick up some disaffected Republicans. But now, and maybe that was 10 years ago I was thinking that, or I don't know, less. But now I'm realizing that there's really no going back to quote unquote normal, that Democrats actually maybe need to completely reshape the entire party just as Republicans did. And I'm curious as to what you guys think of that.
I think with one of the big changes in America over my lifetime is just that there's been like educational sorting, right? And like people who are college educated are more and more likely to be Democrats. People who are not are more and more likely to be Republicans. And even when you account for race, that's becoming more and more so. And so you used to have like there are a lot more like written debates about like what Republicans should be. Like after Romney lost, for example, there was this whole thing about like should Republicans be more like liberal on immigration. Obviously that didn't happen. There's a whole like reformicon movement that kept trying to like, there's this long project of like, what should we do when we repeal Obamacare? And even by the time they actually won, the whole thing sort of fell apart because they didn't have like an intellectual consensus about it. There are still those people in the Republican coalition, but like they're very smaller portion. They don't really control the party, right? It's like, a lot of it is like Trump will say a thing and people will like try to retroactively justify it, which actually makes it in some ways easier to manage a coalition versus for Democrats. Like we can't just like reshape the party because there's like one strong person says that's what it's going to be. And then like, you don't really have to stick to ideas. It's just like whatever Trump says is like, now we're for that, right? Like, are we pro-China 1 week? Are we anti-China 1 week? Are we releasing the Epstein files? Are we not releasing the Epstein files? It's just like whatever Daddy Trump says. Democrats are, for good or for ill, we are a very neurotic group of people who likes to write things down a lot and have arguments online all the time. So it means that like, that's how we will have to change. Like we have to argue it out and have these discussions.
Yeah. I grew up in Staten Island, which is very different than Cambridge, where I live now. Cambridge is a very liberal, highly educated place. The median resident has a master's degree. I think the only place that's more educated is actually where you are, Justine. Um, but like Staten Island was very
I
much
think
like,
we're number 2, by the way. I think
oh,
Los Alamos is number 1, Falls Church is number 2. Yeah.
yeah. But where I grew up, Staten Island was very much like police officer, firefighter country, a place that voted for Obama, but then eventually ended up voting for Trump in pretty big numbers, like one of those huge swing places. And it's like a place where I spent the first 18 years of my life, or not the first 18, but close to 14 years of my life. Um, and so I think that like a lot of what Matt says is something that like I don't think that you can run as liberal as I am here and what I believe in Staten Island. And you see that the elected officials who do win, whether they're Democrats, they're more like Max Rose than here. At the same time, like I do think that like I'm trying to piece together like what makes Democrats popular again, because it feels like nothing really is resonating right now, and there's no leader and no figure, and almost like there's a Trumpism without Trump, where like everyone else just does worse down ballot than Trump does. And so it makes me think like, sure, maybe you need someone who can like fit the culture of the place when they're running down ballot and they don't get that microphone to really convince people of their ideas. And I think that that's a lot of what Matt makes the argument for. And like I kind of wonder, like, is the presidency or a few like high visibility races in particular are different, because you also get the airtime to actually try to persuade people. And we didn't fully get into that conversation, but that's been a lot of what's been on my mind recently.
I'm trying to like mentally picture a Staten Island Burhan.
I mean, I think of Staten
Yo,
Island
Mark
as
in
like,
here, like Burhan. Like,
I think Staten Island is the iconic of, you think of like left urbanism, or like transit oriented urbanism of like, we're going to build housing near transit and no parking minimums, and you're going to get around by train. I think Staten Island is your example of like, what if you were like loved your car but also liked urbanism? Like it's like the biggest mall is in Staten Island in New York City, but then it's just like as far as you can see in every direction is just parking, right? And it's just like that endlessly, where it's just like there's like a huge like 20-story building, but then there'll just be like 5 blocks of parking nearby. It's fascinating.
That
Yeah.
is that is definitely. It's
Yeah.
just funny though. I now I can't get the image of you with a Staten Island accent out of my head. So
I will say, like, there's fun little connections. Like the two people who are most known from Staten Island are like what we call the duality of Staten Island. Is one, you have like Pete Davidson, right? His dad
yeah,
was a firefighter, died in 9/11. Goes becomes like a college dropout, and like goes on SNL. And then like my high school teacher was Colin Joe's dad, and Colin went to Harvard, graduated, is now like married to Scarlett Johansson, and also ended up on SNL. And so those are the two life paths that every Staten Island resident has.
yeah. That's so funny. So Staten Island is known for its SNL alumni. um, it's funny though, because like thinking about this shift in the Democratic Party, I don't know, I just know in like 20 years we're going to be reading about this in history textbooks, and I just wish sometimes that we could be living through, I don't know, I'm thinking about like presidents who are unknown, like, or not thought of much. Let's say like Millard Fillmore. Like, why couldn't I be living when like Millard Fillmore was around? Why can't we have just like boring politics? But no, we have to have interesting stuff and shifts in the parties and new movements coming about. We actually had the chance to talk to Matthew Yglesias about the shift in the Democratic Party. And yes, it's the same Matthew Yglesias that we heard at the top of the episode being protested. He's also the author of the Slow, Boring newsletter, and we asked him about his common sense Democrat Manifesto and whether his roadmap for Democrats still holds up after all of these internal battles that we've been seeing.
Yeah, I mean, nothing you write holds up perfectly over time. But this was my diagnosis at the time for Democrats. I think, in political terms, I think it's just very important to be in touch with where voters are on cultural and moral values type issues, and that's really, really central. But then also on economic policy, that if you take seriously the kinds of things that progressive-minded people say about economics, right? Like, we need to care a lot about the material welfare of working class people. And like, I completely agree with that. But to acknowledge that, economic growth plays a big role in that, you know, a strong welfare state is really important. It's particularly important to the poorest of the poor, to the elderly, to the disabled, to people who are sick. But what powers all of that forward is like real economic opportunity and growth. You know, Burhan represents, you know, a great city. Cambridge, Massachusetts is a great place to live. All of Greater Boston is one of America's best places in terms of job opportunities, quality of life, public safety, that kind of thing. But like people are not flocking to the Greater Boston area in droves because you like literally can't. Right. It's like not a growing place. And if you're a political party where that, you know, that's what people's understanding is of like, what does it mean for Democrats to govern is like best case scenario. You'll have like a really nice city that nobody can afford to live in, you know, or in California terms, maybe like the public services won't be as good as in Massachusetts, but the weather will be better. And also people won't be able to afford to live there. You know, or it'll be like New York and it's like really cool, but people can't afford to live there. Like that's not like, that's not a good look. You can't take that to Wisconsin and Michigan and be like, put us in charge and we're going to make it better. So, you know, I think that all holds up pretty well. The discourse has taken some different directions, and I didn't use the terminology of abundance, I think, in that piece, but, you know, it aligns with what I was trying to say there.
Do you think that the YIMBY movement and advocating for more housing would actually hold up in places like Iowa, Michigan, the center of the country? Or do you think it's pretty polarizing?
Well, I mean, I think there's ways in which it does and ways in which it doesn't, right? I mean, the YIMBY movement, as I've experienced it, really comes out of big, dense cities, you know, and part of what drove me to be interested in this topic personally was that, like, I really like cities. You know, I have an e-bike, or I did until it got stolen in DC, and drive it around. And, you know, people who lived in San Francisco and like loved the city, right? And that kind of like pro-urbanist sentiment. I mean, it's very important to me personally. I don't think it makes a ton of sense to like go to Iowa City and say like, you know, everybody's got to live in big cities, right? But housing affordability does matter, I think, everywhere in the country right now. And you don't have the exact same barriers to housing supply. I'm in Maine right now. That situation is obviously very different from the situation in DC or San Francisco or Boston, but they have a housing scarcity issue. And so I think like YIMBYism in Maine looks more like allowing small lot single family homes. It looks like allowing ADUs. It looks like sort of very selective elements of density in Portland and a couple other places. So you don't have YIMBYism as urbanism necessarily in middle America, but like, you know, people should be able to build homes, you know, I think has become important everywhere, sort of, you know, unfortunately. You know, other aspects of abundance may be more significant politically in certain kinds of swing states, stuff that relates to energy, stuff that relates to other aspects of infrastructure.
I was actually a little curious about that. Well, first I have to defend Cambridge a little bit, which is to say, I think that you're right about how expensive it is. One of the things that I thought was super interesting before I moved to Cambridge, I originally grew up in New York, is that New York is also known for high taxes.
Mm-hmm.
And Cambridge, actually, because of all the development that we have, we're pretty good at commercial development, just not residential. Actually, has the lowest property taxes in the state, too. So it's interesting how you do get all those good services, but still have low property taxes in a pretty liberal place. And I thought that was also one of the benefits of development that we don't talk about as much. I think my question a little bit is that, you know, I really like abundance framing. Like, you know, as someone who was part of the YIMBY movement for a long time, I like the abundance framing because it is about all these other things that like kind of do scratch that little deregulation itch you get sometimes. I think that my thought is that like, are we having a little bit well, I guess two questions. The first one would be, how do you feel? Like, you wrote this book about like the rent is too damn high, like all these years ago, and now it's like become this like national conversation in abundance, and it was housing conversation for a little while, but you were at the very beginning, and now like Derek and Ezra wrote this book, and now everyone's calling it abundance.
Well, you know, I mean, in some ways, I mean, I like that terminology, if only because, you know, I wrote The Rent is Too Damn High in 2012. And, you know, we talked a lot.
I believe as one of the 13 people who bought
But
that
there you go.
mortgage.
Yeah, early adopters. And so we were talking about like we wanted housing to be affordable. But like, I mean, as you know, like affordable housing is like kind of like very technical, sort of regulatory jargon type issue. And I think it's important. I mean, like affordable housing in the sense of like housing for poor people is an important subject in American life. But the idea of abundance speaks to something broader, which is like having a growing community. And I think the point you were making about property taxes, for example, is important, right? That there are fiscal benefits to having a growing community, right? That like all of the commercial development around Kendall Square has, caused some inconveniences to some people, and there's extra traffic, and there might be reasons to say like, oh, this is bad. But it's had real benefits, in terms of being able to have high quality public services at relatively low tax rates, right? And that's something that, like mayors and council members and governors should be thinking about everywhere, right? That like I know in New Jersey, there's a lot of skepticism of increased development that, a lot of people moved there because they wanted a suburban lifestyle. It's actually the densest state, even though it doesn't have big cities, but they have super high property taxes that people are really mad about. They've got serious like pension obligation issues that are hard to deal with. And the best way to address all of those things is ultimately going to be through allowing market rate real estate development. There's a lot of demand for construction in New Jersey. And that's an issue that sort of goes beyond the like narrow affordability question and just speaks more to like broad governance. Like how do we make these places like all around good places to live in which, like the schools work and people are getting what they want and they're not being crushed by tax. I'm a liberal, I'm a progressive. I sort of favor high taxes, but all else being equal, I would rather pay lower taxes. And I think that's like how everybody feels. And part of doing a good job of like governing a place is like, it's not tax cuts at all costs, but it's like, yeah, like try to make it possible to deliver the services that people want without super high taxes. And that speaks to, I think abundance speaks to that kind of larger concept.
I'm curious about on that question of like taxation and affordable housing. I've had this argument like over 10 years of my life with people from the like only affordable housing world. Well, they'll say, oh, we should just fund it through taxes and so on. And then when you actually like run the math, you're like, well, okay, how are we going to quadruple like the budget of San Francisco or like eight-tuple the California budget to like produce this? And is there ever like that's usually where the conversation ends for me. And this is with people who like work full time in that field, who are like affordable tenant organizers, people who are running nonprofits, like they kind of just stop. Have you ever gotten further in that conversation? Like, do you have a sense of?
Everybody, I like budgetary trade-offs are everybody's least favorite thing about politics, right? I mean, you just sort of want to ask for more for your thing. And, people in advocacy organizations, it's like, that's their job is to be like, you should give us more money. And like, that's fine. But like elected officials, have to deal with these issues. And I think like part of the high level pitch of like YIMBYism is that it makes these budgetary trade-offs a little bit easier to deal with. And you can have a kind of a positive flywheel in which, you have money and you can come on and do things. You never know when people are in the sort of affordable only camp, is that like a hard ideological commitment, or is it just kind of a pretext, right? I mean, I think you sometimes get these kind of Baptist and bootlegger coalitions where what they actually want is like no housing, but they don't want to say no housing. So they'll say, well, only 100% affordable housing at like, 60% AMI, et cetera, et cetera. And then they just know that in practice, very little housing of that sort will actually get constructed. But if you want to maximize the amount of like subsidized units that are available, the best way to do that is to have a pretty unconstrained building environment, which creates the fiscal resources to provide subsidy.
So I actually wanted to lead into abundance in the other direction as well. I get a little bit nervous as abundance has become like a national conversation, because for a long time, YIMBYism was like a promise I feel like we could keep, which is like, hey,
Mhm.
build more housing. I promise. Like, supply demand is real, and like there will be all these benefits if you build housing, and prices might go down. More people get to live in your city. Like, it felt very doable and achievable. Now it's almost become like this, like, this is the idea that will win back the Democratic Party to like national power, right? And so you've seen a lot of different iterations of that. I think you've quoted like the Arizona senator who used the term like big ass Trump abundance to describe what he thinks that like Democrats
Yeah.
should do to win back working class people. I was thinking, what do you think that means? And like, is that a promise? Do you think it really does appeal in that natural way, or it could?
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
that big ass truck abundance. That was me trying to synthesize.
Uh,
Ruben Gallego, senator from Arizona. He was saying like he said like every Latino man wants his big ass truck, and so I was saying that like that's like a kind of an abundance agenda, but it's not really the one that coastal YIMBYs have been talking about. I mean, I think I have mixed feelings about all this because, like, I strongly believe in YIMBYism as a concept. It's something I've been writing about since before we had that term. And now, if the term is abundance or housing abundance, like, I think that's all great. I don't think it's like the center of the Democratic Party's political problems, and this gets a little bit tricky. I had been writing a little bit about transgender issues and like how I thought Democrats should be more moderate on that kind of thing. And then I was invited to come to San Francisco and speak at an event with Scott Wiener. Was very progressive on LGBT issues, and that's a calling card of his. And he was like, Matt, like, people are really mad at me. And I was like, you know what, like, throw me under the bus. Like, I don't care. And so he did a little. And I said, look, I mean, part of the case I would make for YIMBYism to people who are very progressive on cultural issues is that like we need to make it possible for people to move to the places where we live, and we govern and so on and so forth. But I do also think that like electorally, there's probably just more juice in these kind of disputes about crime, immigration, transgender issues, women's sports, et cetera, than there is in like technical economic policy discussions. I mean, I think that's just the reality. If you're going to tell people like, well, I'm going to cancel you, because you have an opinion that like 60, 70% of the public holds, it's like, it's going to be hard to get that person's vote. That's like the crude reality of it. At the same time, like governing well is really important. That's like why we care about politics at all in the first place. And I think that like, having housing for people is like central to that. It's the biggest item on the household budget. And to some extent, like good governance is its own reward. I just wouldn't say that it should be like the top thing in my political diagnosis of like what hurt Kamala Harris in Michigan.
What would you say is the top thing that hurt Kamala Harris in Michigan?
So, I mean, she had kind of two things, right? I mean, one was that in 2020, she staked out a number of positions that were to the left of Joe Biden's positions. She kind of walked away from that politics, but she never had like a good explanation, if you know what I mean. It wasn't like 100% convincing to people when she was like, oh, I'm not for banning fracking anymore. But it's like, okay, but like, why? Right? She didn't do a good job with that. The other thing was, she was invited very clearly on The View and on a couple other occasions to be like, how would you be different from Joe Biden? Right? When she launched her campaign, it was this kind of like incredible breath of fresh air. I think like Democrats got really excited about it. She started this chant, we're not going back. And I was like, yeah, like we're not going back. And like what exactly did that mean? Like I couldn't say, but it carried like a veneer of like, we're not going back to Donald Trump's first administration, but also this won't just be like a rehash of Biden. And, I mean, I think like the low hanging fruit for her would have been to say like, I love Joe Biden. He was great. He accomplished great things. But as soon as he acted decisively on the border, the situation got way better. But like, why did he wait 3 years to do that? and there's different ways you could come at it, but like, and the whole psychology of like why she didn't want to throw him under the bus. I mean, that's interesting. We'll see more reporting on it. I hear conflicting reports from different people, but I mean, immigration, inflation. I mean, those were the killer issues in 24. She came close. She had a good run in the campaign where she gained a ton of ground in the polls, but she just she didn't wear well. I think in that sense, she couldn't really articulate how was this different from 4 more years of Joe Biden.
One thing that people who sort of disagree with the let's moderate socially to win elections approach is to say that this is too nuanced an argument that as long as you are more left wing than Republicans, voters aren't going to treat it seriously. And I think of Scott Wiener, for example. It's it's true he's passed a lot of very progressive LGBT bills, but I also have tons of people who because they knew I worked for him say the most ludicrous things of Scott Wiener is a pedophile and he passed a law to legalize pedophilia, and so the argument goes it's you're wasting your time moderating on social issues. You should try to be like Zoran Mamdani and just really hammer economic issues.
I mean, I think if you're running in New York City, you should probably be like Zoran Mamdani. But I don't think the question facing Democrats is how do you win an election in New York City? People often talk themselves into this idea that there's no point in moderating. But I remember after the Dobbs decision, Republicans were facing tremendous backlash. They were losing elections over it. And Trump at some point is we're not going to ban abortion. We're not. And of course he didn't convince anyone. I wrote articles that were don't believe this fucking guy. It's in the Republican platform, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it reassured some people, when he moved to the center there. I think Mamdani, for example, has shifted away from defund the police. Even in New York City, that was not a winning message. It's not what people wanted. I don't think he I know lots of people who are I don't trust this guy. He didn't have a good explanation. But I know lots of other people for whom they're that is good enough. They like him on other reasons. They had some doubts about that, but he's nope. That's not what I'm for anymore. It's fine, it's good enough, right? And so on all these things, it's never enough for the person who's number one issue, right? Is I want to reimpose traditional gender norms all across society. I know people who are serious evangelical Christians. And there's no amount of moderating that Democrats are going to do on anything that's going to appease those people, because they're incredibly right-wing, right? But there's lots and lots of other people who just kind of want to hear, I hear you, these issues are complex, reasonable people can disagree. And you're all right, I'm one of the reasonable people, here we are. And that's how politics has always been practiced. Barack Obama was marriage is between a man and a woman at one point. His whole famous race speech was had this part about how his grandma would cross the street when she saw a black guy coming, and he was okay with that. And I don't know, but that's just part of the practice of politics, is trying to get people in the squishy middle to be I'm okay with this guy because he's okay with me.
I mean, I think that the part of that I the version of that I would say is that you really need a candidate who fits your city, state, whatever you're running as. And sometimes that does mean being more socially conservative, and sometimes it doesn't. And I think that you do see that across different places of overperformers, in especially purple states end up being more conservative on average. But I was curious, I think making it really detailed is very helpful, right? So everyone's is pretty down on the fact that Democrats are probably not going to win back the Senate in 2026, right? We have a few pickup opportunities, maybe Iowa. Is it you should run a candidate who's just the average Democrat, but just a little bit more socially conservative? Is it running a Dan Osborne who's just not at all affiliated with the party because the party has a bad brand? Or is it just throw someone who has completely different political beliefs and just a hodgepodge?
Well, to be even more specific, actually, just to be like Sherrod Brown, right? He's running. And like he'll like probably do well, but come short. But like, what would you advise him to do? Like, not just say like broadly more socially conservative, but like, should he give a speech about now he like thinks differently about guns, or
I mean,
like
it's tough. I mean, I'm not sure like a retread is the best example, but like higher, let's say, like I think like somebody who can come. I think the best thing to do would be to like go to a gun control group, and like come speak to them and say, you know what, like I understand that like guns are responsible for a lot of homicides in the United States of America, but those homicides are overwhelmingly small concealed handguns that are being carried by people who are already not allowed to carry guns. And I think the tendency of like woke liberals in big cities to like scapegoat rural long gun owning hobbyists for America's crime problems is like genuinely wrong and bad, and you shouldn't do it, and like it would be high profile, it would be a big deal, and it would say to people in Iowa, oh, this guy gets it, like he has like real courage and like understands not just like where I am on the issue, but like my gripe with like urban liberals who are doing. I'm trying to channel my father-in-law a little bit, who's a Texas rancher and gun owner and who hates Trump, but has like really strong opinions about, I don't know. I don't care. It's not my thing. But I think the biggest thing for Democrats in the Senate actually isn't what the individual candidates do. I think it's what the caucus does. When I think that Chuck Schumer and Brian Schatz and the other people in leadership really need to have a bit of like a come to Jesus moment. They're both Jewish, of course, but that doesn't mean we can't come to Jesus. And that's part of the point. And to just be like, to say, listen, we understand that the social and moral values that prevail in New York and Hawaii are not the social and moral values that prevail in Iowa and North Carolina and Ohio, and that those are the states where the majority is going to be made. And so I'm not going to, if I'm Chuck Schumer or Brian Schatz, I'm not going to disavow my personal belief in, say, gun control. But I'm going to tell you, like, it is not the national agenda of the Democratic Party Senate caucus. Like, there is not a majority for that. When we had a majority, it was based on guys like Joe Manchin and John Tester, who were not for banning assault weapons. And so, like, I am going to frame a national agenda for Senate Democrats that can win nationally. That means tax fairness. It means defend Medicaid. It means raise the minimum wage, things like that. And it means like leaving this other stuff aside, again, without like being untrue to yourself, right? In terms of like, this is me, this is where I am, these are my values, but to say like, I know what is and isn't like an agenda for America, because then that means that Sherrod Brown or whoever else is running in Iowa, Ohio, these other places can stand by side with me and say like, what is it that we are doing together as Democrats, right? Is like, we are defending Medicaid. I think that's a tough turn of mind for everybody, but it's the reality. It's the map that we can all see, and we do know in the opposite direction, right? I mean, when I was a kid, I grew up in New York, and Rudy Giuliani was running for mayor. And, he had a lot of wind at his back because people were upset about crime. People liked his message on crime, but there was incredible skepticism. Like, am I going to vote for a Republican? And he went out of his way to be like, I am the most pro-choice person who has ever existed on the planet. He was the most pro-gay rights politician in America at that time, one of them. He was like, he talked about like the gay friends he had, gay civil rights, and he was incredibly pro-immigrant as well. He made New York a sanctuary city before that was like a term that anybody knew anything about. And that's because like he wanted to win the election. And he had supporters, rich businessmen who live in New York and like low taxes, cops, tough on crime people. And they were like, I want him to win, and they accepted that like the moral and cultural values that prevail in New York City are very cosmopolitan. Like that's who moves to New York. Immigration is like so tightly wound into the fabric of that city. But that's like not how you win in Montana. That's not what people in Montana think. It's not what they want. It's not what they like. And you have to be okay with that. Or you can be in a whole different line of work, right? Like not electoral politics, where your job is to like change people's minds about things, which is an important part of society. I mean, I'm a writer, when I was first doing my YIMBY takes, my view was like, people don't know this, right? Like, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to change their mind. And I do think that like people's minds have changed on housing. And that's why there is the political space now for like courageous leaders in elected office to pass laws and make real change. But like, that's not, the president of the United States didn't lead that shift in the conventional wisdom. It was like, people posting on the internet.
Do you think that by like Democrats broadening the cultural tent and trying to get people in, like your father-in-law in Texas or wherever else, do they lose the far left? Because you see, I almost feel like the coalition on the left is very different than the coalition on the right, because the right, you're right, like Trump says whatever, and then they go along with it. Whereas on the left, even AOC is getting protested over her stance on Gaza. And so, and same thing with Kamala Harris, who had a pretty big faction that was also protesting her on Gaza, and actually potentially even voted for Trump. So where, like, do Democrats lose people on the far left by trying to maybe get on board disaffected Republicans or others?
I mean, you might, but I think to an extent, it's like a risk that you have to take, and I think you need to say squarely to people on the left, like, I acknowledge that, like, if you want to abstain and throw the race to Republicans, like, you have the power to do that. But I have the power to potentially win this election. And if I win this election, I am going to deliver on things like higher minimum wage, on more affordable healthcare. You have a list of like progressive things that you think are winning issues. And you say to people on the left, it's like, this is the opportunity. Like, I want you to be excited and to come vote for me so that we can do these things together. But like, if you don't want to, like, you can. Like, we can't be endlessly negotiating and renegotiating this in the way that I feel like Biden and Harris were, where every day it was like a new conversation and I'm going to earn your vote, et cetera, et cetera. This is where I think like the idea for like charisma comes up in politics a lot. And I think it's mistaken to think that like what good politicians do is they use like their riz to like hornswoggle swing voters. I think what charismatic politicians do, what Donald Trump did, what Barack Obama did, is that they have mastery over their own base because like they're compelling, they're inspiring, they make people say like, I want to be a part of this. I am excited about the upside of this person winning, even though I don't agree with him about 100% of things. Because look, there's 330 million people in America, right? There's two political parties. You just like, you're not going to have, you could be moderate, you could be progressive, you could be conservative, no matter what. Like, you are going to vote for somebody who you disagree with about some issues. That's like mathematically, there's no other way to do it. And, we have to be clear about that. I think the dynamics around the Gaza issue were a little bit unusual in certain ways. And in some respects, that's like a special case. But, but there's just a general issue where like, to win as a Democrat in America, you need to get people who are very left-wing to vote for you. And you also need to get people who are moderate to vote for you. And the way you do that is you have to have some progressive items in your agenda and also to stiff arm progressives on some areas. And like, that's how Obama did it. That's how Biden did it. I mean, that's how JFK did it. There's only like mathematically, it's the only possible way to win. So like, yes, you have to get the left on board, but you can't be obsessed with that to the exclusion of everything else.
Well, one thing I think actually you've spoken about that is I've always been sort of confused by, I don't know how to get out of this dynamic, is like the actual voters. If you look at like, we're always obsessed with this idea that like if you don't vote left wing enough, we're gonna like lose lots of people to Jill Stein or whatever. But it's never like that huge number. It's always on the margins in specific areas, and for Kamala or Obama or whoever. But on the other hand, it's like safe seat mainstream Democrats are often the ones who are just like terrified of. They might not always stake out very left wing positions, but they'll also just try to like duck issues and so like how does that dynamic work? Where it's like, why is it that we obsess so much about like losing individual left wing voters, but then like elected officials who are, if often a lot of the left wing impulses in the party are not coming from those people, it's coming from just like average safe seat like mainstream Democrat.
I agree. The easiest thing to do, because the vast majority of members of Congress and state legislators, for that matter, are in safe seats, right? So they don't really need to worry about like, how am I going to beat a Republican? They do need to worry a little bit about primaries, but they also need to worry about upward mobility in their career, right? And so, I think there's studies about this, that like voters in primaries don't necessarily know that much about candidates' issue positions, but they pay attention to endorsements, right? So if there are, 3 different people running for a future open Senate seat in Massachusetts, if you're the guy who's got like Sierra Club, immigration, something, AFL-CIO checkboxes next to you, well, like it's a liberal state. And people are like, oh, I like those organizations. I'm going to vote for that guy. And so if those organizations are asking you to take even very unreasonable positions, there's a strong incentive to do it. Because in the primary, the details of like what you said and did in the state Senate 7 years ago aren't necessarily going to be litigated out in great detail. So it's like, guys, like we're banning plastic straws, right? And so people do it if that's what they're being asked to do. And ultimately, like, I think you need to have more sensible and more disciplined behavior throughout the whole stack. Like the safe seat members, the advocacy groups, the donors to the advocacy groups, the program officers at the foundations, the people who just like are social peers of the staffers for the safe seat members, to just be like, we gotta like get in touch with what we think is like a realistic governing vision for America. And like, we all need to mostly espouse that, like just as an ethic in life. Even as you could say, like, there's like nothing wrong with having like goofy beliefs or things that are out there. I think a group of people who are sort of good models on this actually are that, I know people who are very, very concerned about the welfare of factory farmed animals. And they are vegans in their personal life, and they love Cory Booker, who's a vegan in his personal life, but they don't spend a lot of time just like going to, like random appearances that Catherine Cortez Masto does and like yelling at her that she shouldn't eat eggs, because they see it's like, it's pointless, right? Like there's no there. They can do persuasion in their daily life, and they can look for, like, a lot of progress has actually been made on, making egg laying conditions for egg laying hens a little bit better. There's like small bore regulatory things you can do, try to work with ministers and faith leaders who have some credibility on the right, do things, but just acknowledge that like most Americans are not that passionate about animal welfare. And if you get like really in their face about it, all that happens is a kind of a backlash dynamic. And so you got to work away in a low key kind of way and talk about the stuff that you can talk about, that you can win on. So, in some ways, like, that's not rocket science, but it's just about, I think, like rebuilding habits that got lost in the kind of mania of the Trump era.
It's funny because you mentioned the Sierra Club and people voting based on seeing what the endorsements are and other things like that. And it's just funny because when I was running for city council in Falls Church, Virginia, I was endorsed by the Sierra Club specifically because of my stance on housing, which I was a pro-housing candidate.
That's great.
But then when people found out that I was endorsed by the Sierra Club because I was pro-housing, I then ended up getting a lot of votes against me because there were a lot of people who didn't want more housing in Falls Church, Virginia. So I guess it can go both ways, but that was a much smaller election. I am curious, is it fair to call you full-fledged YIMBY?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Like
I'm the most YIMBY person.
you are okay. So like in some ways, like you are extreme in terms of like let's build more housing, abolish zoning, I don't whatever else, parking minimums, whatever else.
Sure.
But then like how do you translate that into I guess this gets back to like big ass truck abundance or
Uh-huh.
I guess the abundance movement more generally, because that's extreme, but you're also talking about moderation in terms
Right.
of cultural beliefs. And so in some ways, YIMBYism hasn't become a full Democrat or Republican issue. So that's good. But do you really feel like as a cornerstone of the abundance movement that this is something that can really be broadly popular across the US?
I mean, in different forms, yes. I mean, I think like the most important thing about it is to stay chill. You know what I mean? So like Texas passed a big kind of zoning preemption law recently, and it was bipartisan, which is great. And the way they got it together was that it like in a very unprincipled way basically like just applies to the big cities of Texas plus a handful of the suburbs of Dallas. And I could look at that and be like, this is fucking bullshit. You know, like you've got to put like a 20-story apartment building right in the middle of like the ritziest suburb of Houston or something. Or I can say, like, you know what? Like, this is a pretty good bill. This is going to get a lot of housing built. It's something that rural Republicans were comfortable voting for. It's something that a critical mass of the Democrats from those cities was comfortable voting for. It's good. There's a point in my life, and there's a different. I think if I was in Cambridge, it's probably. I mean, you tell me, Burr, but like, I think it's probably productive in Cambridge housing politics to like talk about Rothstein and the color of law and the history of segregation and things like that, right? And to really kind of like do like the liberal guilt trip about zoning. In Texas, I don't think that that would be productive, right? To be like, aha, by upzoning, but only doing it in counties of over 300,000 people, you're actually perpetuating, the pernicious era. Because that's not what people in Texas care about. It doesn't resonate. It's like a way of seeming like a space alien. Whereas in Cambridge, it's the opposite, right? It's like you want to come to people with like, I am a progressive person. I care about the things that you care about. I have the values that you have. And I have this like technical diagnosis about building heights and, floor area ratios and lot occupancy that is like maybe different from the status quo, but it's going to get us our progress. In Montana, when they passed a YIMBY law by saying that they wanted to avoid California style zoning, which was like 80% bullshit, but it was like something that's, I defer. I've never been to Montana, but like people in the Montana state legislature tell me that that was something that resonated with voters in Montana, right? Because these are like quintessential technical questions. I mean, I remember pitching articles to editors about zoning in like 2015, and they're like, what the fuck are you talking about? Nobody cares about zoning. And there's a level on which that's true, but people care a lot about property rights, or people might care a lot about segregation. There's like different value hooks for these conversations. And, it's not my wheelhouse, honestly, to like tell anyone what people in suburban Texas or rural Montana or, immigrant communities in New Jersey think. But like, that's part of what we have like good politicians for, you must know Falls Church a million times better than I do. And like what people there care about, is something that like has to be worked out and negotiated. But I think ultimately like a more prosperous Falls Church has a lot of upside for a lot of different kinds of people. And like, how can we make that compelling?
I think it's kind of funny how, like, whenever somebody wants to demean the political viability of like their opponent's platform, they make it sound really technical, and then make their own. They're always like, nobody wants to hear about zoning reform. I often hear that from like the anti-monopoly people, and then they're like, yeah, doing extended conversations about the consumer welfare standard. And
yeah,
like,
people
the
really want to
Sherman
hear
Act.
about the Scott Hart Rodino reporting threshold, and like that's, yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, all policy has technical.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I think that it is funny how it breaks down. Like, a huge fan of what happened in Texas and like all of these other places. And in Cambridge, like the politics is different. Like, we totally talk about color of the law, so you got that spot on. And also, like, our recent rezoning was 6 stories, but actually, my like, I think being a cautious person of like not wanting to go further than the electorate, like I was initially thinking of like going to 4 stories and maybe that would be a
Mhm.
gentle density. And then people were like, well, if you go to 6, we get, maybe the inclusionary zoning starts penciling. So actually, Burhan, how about we keep the 4, but we add 2 stories for the inclusionary, and then I will vote for it. And I think
Uh-huh.
that's hilarious because it's like, normally you're more worried about like NIMBY pushback. And in this case, it was like you needed to give the left a little bit more something that like they could say like there are all these affordable units that are being built. Um, and so it's kind of funny how these coalitions come together. I think that's a huge part of why like YIMBYism has been successful, right? Is it takes all these different flavors and both rhetoric, but also in like the specific policy details of how it plays out, right? Like in Texas, inclusionary is just banned, right? It's just not a thing.
Uh-huh.
So I think it's fun. I am a little bit like curious to get your sense of like how do we think about this going forward? Because I feel like YIMBYism has almost had I wouldn't say too much success because like from my perspective, there's a long way to go before we reach like full housing abundance. But like it's been a really good year for passing a bunch of policy. And I'm always a little bit anxious of like, at what point will you go further than the electorate is, start getting pushed back? And to this point, it just seems like, we hit one win, we get the accelerator, like the book abundance gave a bunch of acceleration, all these policies passed, and like no one's lost an election so far.
Mhm.
So like, do you think that this is like full gas pedal, or like, would you urge like DMBs who are listening to like moderate a little bit?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to be careful along a few different dimensions. One thing is that a lot of the wins we've had have been statewide preemption laws, which I think is a powerful strategy, but it also can have a lot of flaws, right? Because it could be the case that, the reason no housing, or so Maine, okay, because I'm in Maine now. Maine has a long time thing where towns are supposed to designate growth zones, but nothing happened if you designated a growth zone. You're just supposed to designate some growth zones. So the state legislature recently said, well, you have to allow 3 ADUs on any lot that's inside one of your designated growth zones. So in the abstract, that's going to unleash an incredible torrent of new housing in Maine. I think that in practice, a lot of towns are going to change their designated growth zones in response to this, right? Because, you can, it was the case that like lot size rules were the mechanism through which new housing was being blocked. But if you say, no, you can't use that mechanism, towns can come up with another mechanism. And so I don't want people to get into a dynamic where states pass a lot of laws and there's a lot of excitement, but then nothing happens because it's undermined at the local level and we like lose track of what we're even doing. Part of what's exciting about Cambridge is that because you did it at the city level, I think we can have like reasonable level of confidence that the implementation will be done the way the council wanted it to. The other thing, which you'll have to tell me about, is there's a question of how well do the elected officials understand what they are doing, right? So like Mayor Karen Bass in Los Angeles promulgated an executive order that was like very pro-housing and that got a ton of new housing applications filed. And then people got upset and she immediately retreated. And it seems like she actually didn't intend for her executive order to be as efficacious as it was. That what she wanted was to do something like splashy, but that wouldn't actually lead to a lot of construction, right? So you need people who have a little bit of guts, you know what I mean? Who like, if 6-story buildings that comply with inclusionary zoning start going up in Cambridge, that like you're going to say, that's good. And if somebody's like, oh, I'm mad, because like now there's more cars on the block, it's like, I understand. I hear where you're not like, fuck you, I'm an asshole, but like this is what we wanted when we passed this law. Like we intended for these buildings to be built rather than, we were just doing it for show, because I think we haven't yet had a real test Like there has not been a NIMBY backlash election anywhere. Now we saw in New Jersey, right? Steve Phillip was a great YIMBY mayor of Jersey City. He ran for governor. He didn't catch fire. Mikey Sherrill, who won that primary, she's abundance-ish. I think she's fine. But like Phillip was a champion on this topic. And clearly the voters were a little on that. I don't want to say that's why he lost, but it didn't like power him to victory, So clearly like the electorate seems open to like YIMBY politicians and YIMBY laws, but not necessarily demanding it. So I think we need to be cognizant, right? Like we've got to have our eyes open about what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I would say 2 points. One is that like I think all the city councilors knew what we were doing, but it's not like the public like kind of understood that this conversation was going on, but until it's real, it's not real, right? So like we went from like one neighborhood in Riverside over the last 15 years saw 4 units being built, and now they have the first project that's going on because the zoning just passed, right? And it's like 77 units, no parking. It's going to replace a old 1-story funeral home with just like a 6-story building, right? And what's crazy about the zoning is that like I think people don't recognize how big it is. Like I wrote it, so like I knew all the details, but like we have more zoned capacity for housing in Cambridge, like 6.5 square miles, than we do in the rest of the state combined. Like it's actually bonkers, the numbers.
When I saw it, I was taken aback when I read a news account of the law. So I hope it works out.
Yeah, so we'll see what happens. There's an election in 2-3 months. My other like just like interesting point is like mostly we talk about like left.
Actually, let's take a moment. I just want to say, is this officially Matt Yglesias is endorsing the re-election of Burhan Azeem?
Absolutely.
I'm not sure if that's a positive or a negative in Cambridge, but I'll take it. What I think is really interesting is that we talk about like progressives, left, moderate, conservative, whatever. What's interesting about YIMBYism is I feel like regardless of your political spectrum, it's like kind of like for lack of a word, there's a huge age dynamic where it's like younger people, whether they're conservative or liberal, tend to be way more YIMBY than they're older. And it's like, it's a weird mapping onto politics that I don't think you see in anything else really.
Yeah, I mean, I also do think, I think a lot of NIMBY politics is like literally NIMBY. You know what I mean? Like somebody will be like, I absolutely agree that there should be more housing in our city, but not in my backyard. Something that you have going for you in Cambridge in terms of the boldness with which you've been able to reform is not just smart politicians, good people on the council, a good advocacy organization, but you, I'm not getting this wrong, right? You guys are all elected at large in a ranked choice system, right? So, there isn't like a council member from Riverside who you can get on the phone with and be like, love the zoning reform, Burhan, but like, can we just like stop this one project that happened here? And then the council member is under a lot of pressure to be like, yeah, like how about that one project, right? And you get in a lot of cities, they have a tradition of members deferring to other members across their districts, things like that. I think that if every city in America had Cambridge's electoral system, you would have more YIMBY wins, because people looking at large can say there's going to be big benefits to the city as a whole, particularly in cities that are larger than Cambridge, frankly, right? That if you are looking, like DC has had 4 mayors in the time that I have lived here. And the mayor has always been relatively pro-housing. And there has always been pushback from individual council members. And what the pushback is or where it comes from keeps varying according to, like exactly what we're talking about in any given period in time, because everyone has always been for housing someplace else, right? Like I never meet a like principled anti-housing person who's like, I'm incredibly opposed to apartment buildings being built on the other side of town, or like in a different city that I don't live in, or like, I really want Seattle to have housing. That's not what people think about, but they think about traffic. They worry about maybe crime, depending on where it is. They worry about access to their particular school, depending on how the school zoning kind of situation works. They worry about the aesthetic impact in their neighborhood, things like that. So, the more you can have an election system that lets people think about broader kinds of issues, the more you have it. And then, yeah, I mean, there's a younger cohort of people who are not the, how do I put it? There's like a set of urban baby boomers who stayed in the city when most of their peers were leaving. And they have a kind of a preservationist mindset. And then you have millennial and younger urban residents who came into the city, often having like grown up in the suburbs. And they're like, I want this. Like, I want in on this. And they've lived through price appreciation, not as like, there's this like right-wing talking point where they're like, how does Elizabeth Warren get to be a multimillionaire? And like the answer is like she and her husband bought urban real estate in the 80s. And like, that's like, all my friends' parents in Greenwich Village in New York, they also got to be multimillionaires that way. People my age, people your age, younger people, like we didn't get that, right? Like we want to be able to live in the city. We want to be able to raise kids here. And so whether you're conservative, liberal, progressive, socialist, whatever, there's just like a different mentality to the contemporary urban experience.
We have about 5 minutes left, so we'll try to wrap up quickly, but I do want to get in there. What do you think of the pushback to abundance generally, calling it a neoliberalist front, or that this is a movement that doesn't consider power or corporate power?
Mm-hmm.
And if I could just add,
yeah.
sorry, specifically, because I feel like this is a broad question, but I feel like the pushback has evolved over time. So how do you see that change?
I find this like corporate power thing to be a little bit weird. I mean, there's a lot of different issues that matter in life, right? I'm a parent. I've got a 10-year-old. I and most parents who I know have a lot of concern about like screen time and social media and our children. And we're like looking for regulatory solutions that might help us there. And clearly, if you're going to regulate social media companies, you have to take on the power that those companies wield. I am interested in progressive taxation. Janet Yellen and Joe Biden like tried to close some international tax loopholes that big multinational companies use. And like the power of big multinational corporations is like very relevant subject. If we're talking about taxes, I don't think it is true that the political power of large corporations is an important aspect of housing in America. They're just like not that big. Like the biggest home builder in America is not like a top 10 company. It's not a top 20 company. I think it's maybe a top 50 company, but it's just not that big. And big housing companies aren't that big a piece of the housing pie because most of the housing stock is old. Housing is by far the most dispersed asset class in America, right? I mean, the majority of housing units in the United States are owned by owner occupants. So that's just like analytically true. And so if the only thing you care about is corporate power, then I think you're just not going to have a lot to say about housing. If the only thing you care about is housing, I don't think you're going to have a lot to say about corporate power. If you're a normal person and you have like more than one topic that you care about, you're just going to think different things depending on what you're talking about. And that's okay. I think David Sirota had this weird tweet the other day where he's like, oh, in the 90s, they said we should deregulate. And that led to a mortgage crisis. And now these YIMBYs also want to deregulate. And I'm like, well, okay. But like, we're talking about different things. It's like, should you dump toxic waste into the Charles River? Like, no, like don't deregulate that. Should you be allowed to build an apartment building near the Charles River? Like, yes, right? Like you have to like pay attention to the topic at hand. If somebody wants to tell me like, I don't care about housing, I don't think that's interesting. Like, that's fine. Like that's okay. Like not everybody has to be interested in everything. But I think it's bad. I think it's like a real internet person pathology to be like, how dare you talk about this thing that isn't my personal top interest? And I think a great contrary model to that is Elizabeth Warren, who we know is not like a big proponent of deregulation, but she just worked with Tim Scott to have like a very strong YIMBY housing bill. I have a lot of things that I disagree with her about, but like that's an amazing piece of of legislation that she worked on. I also have a lot of things that I disagree with Tim Scott about. Elizabeth Warren and Tim Scott have a lot of things that they disagree with each other about. But if we're like adults and not toddlers about politics and policy, it's like there's a lot of issues, there's a lot of room for compromise, there's a lot of room for agreement. It could sound perverse to be like, how can you say that like Donald Trump is a threat to democracy and then like also work with his like lickspittle Tim Scott on a bill about mobile home regulation? But I don't know. It's like that's just how it works. That's how the game is played. Like you have to, in a legislature, work with people from the other party. And if you didn't disagree with them about things, you wouldn't be in the other party from them. And so I don't know, it's like, I don't want to be like la-di-da, can't we all just get along? But without getting along, we should still be able to find points of agreement and move the ball forward on those things.
Since we're running into time, I wanted to ask, we've talked a lot about housing, and I feel like the next sort of step for abundance beyond housing and YIMBY stuff is like clean energy. And with YIMBY, sort of the strategy initially was like people were trying to convince the existing like houser community of like nonprofit housing and advocates to sort of be more YIMBY. And that never really happened. And so YIMBY had to grow its own independent movement and now has brought along a lot of those people. With clean energy, I think we're still in the phase of like folks are trying to persuade environmental groups that exist that they should be more pro-permitting reform, like reforming NEPA, stuff like that. Do you think that will be successful, or do you think like the strategy goes through like you're going to have to build like a clean energy YIMBY movement essentially?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there will probably, I mean, it won't be exactly the same, but yeah, I mean, I think that if you look at the Environmental Defense Fund, for example, big environmental group, it was literally created to oppose the construction of a hydroelectric dam in upstate New York. Like that's their foundational thing. Since that time, they have taken on more issues. Climate change has become important, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But like trying to block a clean energy project was their original thing. These are, at some level in their DNA, they are degrowth conservationist organizations. They are not climate organizations. They are not clean energy organizations. Because Sierra Club is membership driven, it can have different chapters who do different things. There's some great Sierra Club locals around America that are doing really good things. There's some ways you can get big green nonprofits to be reasonable, to work with them on things. But I think ultimately you need, if you want to have abundant clean energy, right? If you want to say America is going to keep being a rich country, America is going to electrify heating, transportation, America is going to power all of that ultimately with zero carbon sources, you need people who like have that as their core vision because there's trade-offs in everything, like nuclear plants generate waste and they require mining. Utility scale solar projects consume a lot of open land. Wind turbines can be co-located with agriculture and other things like that. But it's like not like Trump's bit about like the windmills killing birds, gets kind of overstated, but there's something to that. Like there's no totally pristine, zero impact form of energy that's out there. But if you take these things seriously, like you make appropriate trade-offs, you will build transmission lines, do other things like that. But you're going to need some organizations that have that as their primary orientation. I think that's why, it's important that we had an abundance book, that we're having abundance conferences, that we are having abundance podcasts, things like that, to find a social identity for people who like, this is the core of what they're doing, not, preserve some landscape from a dam.
Matt, I want to thank you. Before we go, though, we're going to do 3 rapid fire questions from all of us. My rapid fire question, as rapid as you can be, what races are you watching in 2026 or what issues are you watching too?
Oh man, what races am I watching? That's a tough one. I'm really interested in Iowa. Democrats have a very competitive Senate primary in Iowa, even though it's a real reach and kind of long shot state. And I'll be interested to see what happens there because I think it's telling. I'm also interested in the Maine Senate race where Democrats have the opposite problem. And it seems like you should be able to win in a Kamala Harris state, but nobody wants to run.
I was gonna say any progressive lefty candidate you think has done a good job about talking about cultural issues, while still being like lefty progressive.
I mean, I think that Bernie Sanders does this better than the second gen Bernie people, and I would like them to take seriously the idea that it isn't just that Bernie is an old white man, but that he actually talks about these issues in a different way that they could learn from. Because he is a much stronger electoral performer than any of the like post Bernie leftists. And I think that's because he actually addresses these topics in a different way, even though he still has a quite solid progressive record.
Of the 2028 presidential candidates, who do you think are like the top three most abundant?
I think we're going to have to see. Josh Shapiro seems to kind of have the maybe some of the strongest profile on these kind of issues. But Gavin Newsom has been trying to make waves in a different kind of way, although I think he has a lot of baggage. I think it's smart for people in an abundant space to try to reserve judgment.
Awesome. Matt, well, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to have you back to see how all these political candidates shake out in 2026. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to our very second episode. We would love to hear your feedback and who you think we should have on the platform next. And we will be back in 2 weeks. See you next time, Pie Gang.